What's the key to writing a good song? What does it have to have?
It's got to have the person.
The person meaning you?
It's got to have the heart and soul of a person that's writing it, I think.
Country music has always loved a larger-than-life character, and few figures loom bigger than Loretta Lynn. She was the straight-talking voice of working women, the singer who turned real trouble into sharp, unforgettable songs, and the girl from a Kentucky coal town who changed Nashville by refusing to sound polished or pretend life was prettier than it was. But long before the awards, the hit records, and the fame, there was a teenage girl growing up fast in a cramped cabin, surrounded by poverty, hard labor, and the narrow choices offered to many young women in rural Appalachia. Her marriage at just 15 was not the beginning of a fairy tale. It was the beginning of a hard, complicated adult life that came at her much too early. And before we go any further, tell us in the comments whether you think early marriage in those days was mostly about love, survival, or simply having no real choice. Because Loretta Lynn's story is really the tragic story of why she married at just 15 years old. A cabin childhood. Loretta Webb came into the world of Butcher Hollow, Kentucky in a tiny coal mining community where comfort was scarce and work started early. She was born in a 2-room log cabin and grew up in a household shaped by long days, little money, and the constant pressure that came with a miner's life. Her father worked in the mines and on the side as a farmer, and the whole family lived close to the bone. That kind of childhood could produce either silence or grit, and in Loretta's case, it produced both. She learned songs from her mother, heard the Grand Ole Opry on a battery radio, and carried a deep sense of where she came from. The music was there, but it was not yet a path out. It was part of daily life, like chores, family stories, and the weight of getting by. For girls in that setting, the road ahead was usually short and plain. There was not much room for prolonged adolescence, self-discovery, or carefully planned futures. You helped your family, grew up quickly, and often stepped into marriage young because adulthood arrived whether you were ready or not. That's what makes her age at marriage less shocking when placed in context and more heartbreaking the longer you think about it. At 15, Loretta was still a child by any modern standard. But in the world around her, childhood could end without warning. 1 month later.
He had taken you to bed?
Yeah.
And did you know what you were doing when that happened?
No, I had no idea what was going on. I know one thing, I didn't like what was going on.
The most startling detail is how quickly it happened. Loretta met Oliver Loretta Lynn, known as Doolittle or Do, and married him about a month later. He was 21, she was 15, and he was the first boy she had ever kissed. That tells you how little time she had to understand what she was stepping into. This was not a long courtship built on years of trust. It was a rush from girlhood into marriage, and that speed says a lot about the culture she lived in. A young woman in a poor rural setting did not always have the luxury of waiting, comparing options, or imagining a dozen different futures for herself. There was also the appeal of being chosen. Later in life, Loretta wrote that Do made her feel special. He made her feel seen. For a young girl from hardship, that kind of attention could feel like safety, promise, and escape all at once. When you're very young, being adored can feel a lot like being protected. That doesn't mean the marriage began from pure desperation or coercion. Feelings were clearly involved. But in Loretta's own telling, love was tangled up with something deeper. He was her security and her safety net. Those are not the words of someone entering a carefree romance. They're the words of someone looking for ground that feels solid. From bride to mother.
What will we do? Pregnant again. It just can't be true.
After the wedding, the couple left Kentucky for Washington State. Loretta was soon pregnant, and within 4 years, she had given birth to 3 children. That's a staggering amount of responsibility for anyone, let alone a girl who had barely left childhood behind. Her life changed almost overnight, from daughter to wife to mother. The marriage did not just make her young, it made her old before her time. While other girls might have still been discovering themselves, Loretta was managing pregnancies, babies, moves, and the demands of an adult household. Motherhood also trapped and strengthened her in equal measure. It limited her freedom, but it also gave her the material that later powered her songwriting. The strain, the jealousy, the exhaustion, the anger, and the humor that filled her records were not invented in a writer's room. They came from living hard and early. Her songs later spoke to women with unusual force because she knew what it meant to carry adult burdens before adulthood had fully formed. When she sang about marriage, cheating, childbirth, and double standards, she was not guessing. She was writing from the middle of a life that had started running too fast, too soon. Hard love.
It hit me around, smacked me and hit me bloody noses and blue eyes and stuff like that.
Loretta never painted her marriage as simple. She said her husband cheated regularly. She said they fought. She also said he believed in her before anyone else and pushed her towards music by buying her a guitar after noticing her voice. That contradiction sits at the center of the whole story. In her own words, she was explaining, not excusing. She called it one of the hardest love stories. That may be the clearest phrase anyone used for their marriage. It was love mixed with instability, devotion mixed with damage, and loyalty mixed with pain. She stayed, but staying did not mean life was easy. There's something especially sad in knowing that the same man who helped launch her career also created much of the turmoil that shaped it. The husband who recognized her talent was also an alcoholic whose behavior put strain on the marriage for years. The man who gave her a guitar also gave her plenty to write about. That tension became the furnace in which Loretta Lynn was formed. Her marriage at 15 was tragic, not simply because it happened young, but because it locked her into an adult bond filled with both support and suffering. She was still becoming herself while trying to survive a husband, a household, and a growing family, turning pain into a voice.
You write from your heart.
Yes, I write whatever is bothering me at the time, and nobody believes that. They said, Loretta, you're going to get in trouble one day because Dude's going to understand that you're writing about him.
What followed is one of the most remarkable turns in country music history. Doo bought her that guitar, she started singing locally, and before long she was chasing radio play, sleeping in the car, eating cheap sandwiches, and pushing her records station by station. In one famous moment, she found her record in a trash can and answered the insult with the kind of fire that later defined her. Her rise was fast, but it was built on years of private struggle. The girl who had married at 15 became the woman who sang about husbands who drank too much, men who cheated, women who were expected to stay quiet, and mothers overwhelmed by repeated childbirth. She widened country music because she had already lived the kind of life many listeners were too embarrassed to describe out loud. That's why her early marriage matters so much. It was not just a biographical detail or a shocking headline fact. It was one of the central events that shaped her voice, her subject matter, and her bond with working women who heard their own lives in her songs. She did not speak from a distance, she spoke from inside the mess. So the tragic reason Loretta Lynn married at 15 was not just romance and not just tradition, it was youth meeting poverty, admiration meeting need, and a hard environment giving a girl very few soft landings. Now it's time to hear from you. When you look at Loretta Lynn's early marriage, do you see a love story, a survival story, or a warning about how fast life could close in on young women from poor backgrounds? Let us know in the comments section below.